The year was 1865. The Civil War had ended, and the streets of New York were caught between hope and hunger. Men in torn uniforms searched for work, women sold bread on corners, and the sound of new freedom echoed faintly in the distance. Yet, even in this land of liberty, shadows of slavery still lingered. At a small auction yard by the Hudson docks, the air was thick with smoke and whispers. Wooden crates stood stacked like walls, and behind one of them sat a girl, barefoot, shivering, her wrists bruised from the rope that bound her. Mr. Harris, an old carpenter, stood quietly at the edge of the crowd. His hair was silver, his hat worn, his hands rough from years of labor. He wasn't there to buy anyone. He had come to sell a few wooden toys he carved to survive the harsh winter. But when his tired eyes met the girl's, something in him shifted. A memory, perhaps, of his own daughter lost years ago to sickness. The auctioneer's voice broke his thoughts. $5. That's all she's worth. No one spoke. The crowd shuffled, some with pity, others with amusement. The girl kept her eyes down, her lips pressed tight as if she had forgotten what hope felt like. Mr. Harris looked into his palm. $5. The last of his savings, enough for a week's food, enough to stay alive. His heart pounded, torn between logic and conscience. Finally, he stepped forward, placed the bills on the table, and said softly, "I'll take her." The auctioneer blinked, surprised, then shrugged. "She's yours, old man." The laughter that followed was sharp and cruel. "What will he do with her?" One man joked, "Build her a cradle." Another sneered. Mr. Harris didn't answer. He took the girl's hand gently, a hand that flinched from touch, and led her away. The city noise faded behind them as they walked through narrow alleys toward the countryside. The cold wind bit through their clothes. Neither spoke for a long time. It wasn't until they reached a small wooden cabin by the river that the old man stopped. He opened the door, revealing a single room, a bed, a table, and a small fireplace struggling to stay lit. "Sit," he said kindly. The girl hesitated, eyes darting between the door and the old man's face. "You're safe here," he assured her. He poured water into a tin cup and handed it to her. She drank slowly, her cracked lips trembling. Then he said the words that changed everything. "You're free now, child. I bought you so no one else could." She stared at him, unsure if she'd heard right. "Free?" she whispered, as if testing the word on her tongue. "Yes," he replied. "No one owns you anymore. Not me, not anyone." Tears welled in her eyes, silent and heavy. She looked down at her hands, still marked by rope burns, then back at the man who had spent his last dollars to give her freedom. Her voice broke as she said, "Why would you do that?" Mr. Harris smiled faintly. "Because everyone deserves a chance to breathe." That night, she couldn't sleep. The small cabin creaked with the wind, the fire cracked, and the old man's cough echoed softly from his bed. She stared at the wooden roof, thinking of the years stolen from her, other people lost, the names forgotten. For the first time, no one would strike her for closing her eyes too early. No one would call her property. She pulled the old man's spare blanket closer and whispered to herself, "Free." A broken bar. It felt strange, almost frightening, like standing at the edge of a vast ocean for the first time. Morning came quietly. The sunlight filtered through the cracked window panes, painting golden stripes across the floor. Mr. Harris was already awake, boiling water for tea. He smiled when he saw her rise. "You can stay as long as you want," he said, stirring the pot. "There's not much, but I'll share what I have." Amara, still unsure of her place, nodded and offered to help. She cleaned the little home, mended torn cloth, and gathered firewood. Her movements were slow at first, but soon there was rhythm, a rhythm of belonging. As days turned to weeks, the fear in her eyes softened. She began to hum softly while working, old tunes she remembered from her mother before the war. Mr. Harris would listen, smiling faintly, his old hands carving toys by the window. "You've got a gift, Amara," he said once. She looked embarrassed. "It's just a song." "No," he said, shaking his head. "It's hope." People have forgotten how to hear it. From that day, her humming filled the small cabin each evening like a quiet prayer. One cold afternoon, Mr. Harris fell ill. His cough grew deeper, his hands too weak to hold his carving tools. Amara stayed by his side, making soup, wrapping him in blankets, and whispering old hymns she barely remembered. "Don't waste your time on an old man," he would say with a weak smile. "I owe you my life," she replied. "No," he corrected gently, "you owe it to yourself to live it." His words stayed with her like warmth in the winter air. One evening, a traveler passing by the river stopped when he heard her singing. The melody carried through the trees a raw, pure, and full of emotion. The man was stunned. He asked her name, but she shyly turned away. "I'm no one," she said. The traveler shook his head. "With a voice like that, you could move mountains." Days later, more people came to hear her sing outside the cabin. They brought food, medicine, even coins, all to thank her for the comfort her songs gave. Mr. Harris would sit by the door, smiling proudly. "See, child," he'd whisper, "you were meant for more." But Amara refused to leave him. "You gave me freedom," she said. "I'll give you my time." The old man's eyes softened. "Freedom means using your voice," he said, not hiding it. His words settled deep in her heart. That night, as the river reflected the moonlight, she sang louder than ever before, her voice rising like a promise to the stars. Weeks later, when she returned from gathering herbs, she found Mr. Harris sitting still, his hat in his lap, a peaceful smile on his face. He had passed quietly in his chair, the fire glowing faintly beside him. On the table lay a small wooden box with her name carved into it. Inside, she found 5 old dollar bills and a note written in shaky handwriting. "My child, these dollars once bought your freedom. Now, let them remind you that freedom must be shared." Amara pressed the note to her heart and wept. She buried him by the river, under the willow tree where he used to sit. For days, she sang their race songs of sorrow, of gratitude, of love that defied chains. The townspeople came, bringing flowers, candles, and tears of their own. The girl once sold for $5 had now given something priceless to them all, and the sound of hope reborn. And though Mr. Harris was gone, his kindness lived in every note she sang. Years later, Amara would stand on grand stages in New York City. Her name shone in lights, her voice broadcast on radio waves that reached every corner of the nation. Reporters asked her, "How did it all begin?" She would smile softly and answer, "With $5, and a man who believed I was worth more." The audience would fall silent, and in that silence, they'd hear the echo of her truth, that even in the darkest times, one act of compassion can change the world. And whenever she passed by the river again, she'd stop at that small grave beneath the willow. She'd place flowers and whisper, "You bought my freedom, Mr. Harris, say, but you also taught me what to do with it." Then she'd close her eyes and sing once more, her voice carrying through the wind, across the water, into the hearts of all who still needed to hear what freedom truly meant. Weeks passed like gentle rivers flowing into one another. Amara stayed beside the old man, learning the rhythm of quiet life. She swept the floors, cooked simple meals, and washed his tools by the water's edge. Each evening, when the sun sank behind the Mississippi, she would sing softly a hymns her mother once whispered while working the fields. Mr. Harris would close his eyes, listening with a faint smile. In her songs, he heard not sorrow, but survival. Her voice seemed to carry every pain, every prayer, every dream that slavery had tried to bury. One day, a fisherman passing by the river stopped rowing his boat. He listened, mesmerized, as Amara's voice floated across the water. He told others in town about the girl with the voice pure as sunrise. Within weeks, strangers began visiting the small wooden cabin just to hear her sing. They brought food, small coins, and flowers. Some sat quietly on the grass, others wept. The newspaper in a nearby town soon wrote an article titled "The Angelic Voice by the River." Mr. Harris read it aloud with trembling hands, tears shining in his old eyes. Amara was embarrassed at first. "I'm no angel," she said, stirring soup over the fire. "I just sing what I feel." Mr. Harris chuckled softly. "That's what makes it holy," he replied. "Real songs don't come from gold records or grand stages, they come from hearts that remember." She didn't fully understand his words, but she could feel their truth. Every note she sang carried her past, the pain, the loss, and the freedom she had finally tasted. Then one evening, as the golden light faded into twilight, a stranger arrived. He wore a long coat, polished boots, and a fine hat, clearly not from their small town. He listened silently as Amara sang by the porch, her voice weaving through the night air. When she finished, the man stepped forward and said, "My name is Edward Blake. I'm a music producer from New York City. I've heard 1,000 voices a broken bar but nothing like yours." Amara froze, unsure what to say. Mr. Harris studied him quietly, sensing both promise and danger in his words. Edward continued, "You could fill theaters, child. You could change the world with that voice." He handed her his card, its edges shining under the lamplight. Amara looked at Mr. Harris, her eyes filled with uncertainty. He smiled, though his gaze lingered with unspoken sorrow. "Go," he said softly. "The world needs to hear you." Amara's lips trembled. "But a broken bar, I can't leave you." The old man placed his hand over hers. "You already gave me more than I ever hoped for, a piece. Now it's your turn to live." The next morning, Amara packed her few belongings, a dress, a comb, and a small wooden carving Mr. Harris had made for her. As she turned to leave, he pressed a folded note into her hand. "For when you forget who you are," he whispered. She hugged him tightly, the weight of goodbye heavy between them. "I'll come back," she promised. He nodded with a faint smile. "I know." As she walked down the dirt path toward the waiting carriage, she looked back one last time. The old man stood in the doorway, his silhouette framed by morning light. The journey to New York was long and full of wonder. The city roared with life, trains clattering, carriages rolling, and people rushing in every direction. Edward took her to a music hall where she sang for the first time before an audience. Her voice, trembling at first, soon soared through the room. When she finished, the crowd rose to their feet, applauding thunderously. For the first time, Amara understood what Mr. Harris meant when he said the world needed her voice. But even amid the cheers, her heart ached for the quiet river and the man who had set her free. Fame came swiftly. Newspapers called her the Nightingale of New York. She sang in grand theaters, her name glowing on posters. Wealthy patrons sent gifts, and musicians begged to work with her. Yet, despite the glamour, Amara never forgot where she came from. Every song she performed carried traces of the river's calm, the wooden cabin's warmth, and the kindness of the man who believed in her. After each concert, she would unfold the note Mr. Harris had given her and read the words he wrote: "Never let applause drown out truth. Sing for hearts, not for crowns." Years passed, and success only grew. She performed for governors, generals, and presidents. But the higher she climbed, the more she missed the simplicity of those early days. One evening, after a grand performance, she stood before her dressing room mirror. The reflection staring back was draped in silk and diamonds, yet her eyes looked tired. She thought of Mr. Harris, wondering if he was still alive. That night, she wrote him a letter, promising to return soon. She never received a reply. 2 months later, she learned through a traveler that the old man had passed peacefully by the river. The news broke her. For days, she didn't sing. The stage lights felt heavy, the applause hollow. She traveled back to Mississippi, alone, and found the small wooden cabin abandoned. Dust covered the furniture, the tools lay untouched, and a faint smell of cedar lingered in the air. Outside, beneath the old willow tree, she found a simple grave marked with a wooden cross. On it was carved, "Eli Harris, a man who believed in freedom." She knelt there for hours, tears tracing silent lines down her cheeks. "You freed me twice," she whispered, "once from chains, and once from fear." From that day, her music changed. Her songs became deeper, filled with soul and memory. When she sang, audiences didn't just hear beauty, they felt history. Her performances became a movement, a voice for those who had none. Reporters asked about her inspiration, and she would always say the same words: "A man once bought me for $5, not to own me, but to give me my life back." The quote spread across the country, printed in newspapers and books, inspiring millions who had known suffering. In time, Amara used her wealth to build something lasting: a school for children who had been abandoned, orphaned, or forgotten by society. She named it the Harris Home of Freedom Song. The building stood near the very river where her story began, its walls echoing with laughter and music. Every child there learned not only to sing but to understand what freedom meant. On the front gate, engraved in brass, were Mr. Harris's words: "Sing for hearts, not for crowns. Visitors from across the nation came to see the place where compassion had taken form. Amara spent her final years teaching young voices how to rise with courage. Every morning, she would sit by the window, watching the river flow, the same river that had once carried her songs into the world. Though her hair turned gray, her spirit remained bright. Music is not about sound, she told her students. It's about remembering. On the anniversary of Mr. Harris's passing, she gathered the children beneath the willow tree and sang the hymn he loved most. The air trembled with emotion, and those who heard swore the old man's spirit was listening too. When Amara passed away peacefully at the age of 70, the entire city mourned. Thousands attended her funeral, but before she died, she left one final note to be read aloud. It said, "If my voice ever meant something to you, let it remind you that freedom begins with kindness. A man with nothing once gave me everything. Do the same for someone else." Her words echoed through the church, and many wept openly. Outside, the children of the Harris home sang her favorite song, their voices blending into a harmony that seemed to reach the heavens. Decades later, people still visit that river, standing quietly under the old willow tree. The school still thrives, run by those she once taught. Inside the home, her portrait hangs beside that of Mr. Harris, two souls connected not by blood, but by love and faith in humanity. And sometimes, when the wind passes through the trees, locals swear they can hear her voice, soft, steady, and full of light, singing the same hymn she sang the day she was freed. Because freedom, like music, never truly dies. It lingers in voices, in memories, in the smallest acts of grace. Mr. Harris's $5 did more than purchase a life. They bought a legacy that would echo across generations. Amara's story became a symbol, a reminder that kindness can break the deepest chains, that compassion can turn strangers into family, and that sometimes, the simplest act can change the entire course of history. And so, her voice still lives by the river, a sound carried by wind, remembered by hearts, and sung by children who never knew her, yet owe their hope to her song. The Harris Home of Freedom song remains not just a school, but a promise that as long as voices rise in truth, the world will never forget the girl who was bought for $5, and the man who gave her the world.